Thank you for having me today. I'm honored to be speaking to you today. I'm very sorry that I cannot be there live and in person, but we're currently in Hawaii for the December 7th ceremonies. Currently, I'm at the Punch Bowl Cemetery inside a dormant extinct volcano. We are honoring nearly the 100 unknown servicemen who were aboard the USS Arizona. So hopefully I will be able to join you guys live after our ceremony is done here. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. As a Colorado native, I've been blessed to live in this great state, surrounded by the Rocky Mountains. My grandfather spent his final years here in Colorado Springs. And while he didn't always love the cold and the snow, which he called termination dust, he embraced Colorado, and it truly embraced him right back. We had the pleasure of seeing my grandfather announce at the Rockies Veterans Day event, but I gotta say, nothing can compare to seeing him on the field at the Broncos Stadium with 76,000 fans giving him a standing ovation. The din was actually so loud that the announcer was completely drowned out, telling the few details of his life. I actually have a clip of it for you guys. There we go. Uh-oh. There we go. My grandfather was born in a small town called Red Cloud, Nebraska in 1922. He was one of 4 kids and spent most of his young years working on the farm. But as the Great Depression hit along with the Dust Bowl, it wiped out nearly all the farming in the Midwest. My grandfather hit his adult years with absolutely no job prospects and no livelihood really. And so he walked into a Navy recruiting center, found out he would earn a steady paycheck of $21 a month, and he never looked back. He enlisted at 18 and did his basic training in the Great Lakes area. Shortly after, he was assigned to the USS Arizona. And as he walked the docks in Bremerton, Washington, he saw for the first time the USS Arizona in dry dock, and nothing could prepare him for that sight. Over 20 feet overhead and 608 feet long, the Arizona was truly a floating city made of pure armored steel. And I think for the first time, he truly felt like he was home. He was assigned to the portside anti-aircraft director as a sight setter. Now, as true with most things, but particularly the US military, sailors had many jobs. For my grandfather, one of them was far more memorable than the others. So he and a small crew played target for the Arizona's 14-inch guns. Now, these 14-inch guns were capable of hitting their target from just under 12 miles away. And my grandpa found out firsthand just how accurate those guns were. His boat was nearly capsized multiple times as the projectiles hit the towed target, sending a concussion wave right at the small skiff that he was piloting. I'd have to say, out of all the jobs in the Navy that my grandfather had, playing target was not one of his favorites. My grandfather and the crew, they trained for weeks off the coast of California, becoming a capable crew. They were firing and reloading their guns in record time, hitting targets from nearly 12 miles away. And the mighty Arizona seemed unstoppable. The whole crew could feel the tension in the air. They weren't just practicing, but they were truly preparing for war. So finally, the battleships turned westward and powered into the Pacific, into the sandy shores of Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So I often wonder what my grandfather saw and what he felt when he pulled into Pearl Harbor and Honolulu for the first time. He had only ever been surrounded by the flatlands of Nebraska, basically cornfields leading away to more cornfields. And he suddenly found himself in the true heavenly paradise. So he had white sand beaches, warm water, constant trade winds cooling them off on hot days. As I said, it felt like paradise. So he and his best friend, Harl Nelson, explored the island and enjoyed being 19 and free. So the ship settled into routine, going out during the day, practicing maneuvers and perfecting their aim. So on October 22nd, 1941, battleships from Pearl Harbor were on maneuvers, which included the Arizona. The battleships had been sailing in line, making about 90-degree starboard turns in unison. The battleship Oklahoma missed her turn and ended up ramming the USS Arizona. So both ships were actually damaged pretty heavily, but the Arizona took the worst of it. And she ended up with a hole in her side, 30 feet by 20 feet. The resulting flooding caused the ship to list about 10 degrees until counter flooding on the other side of the ship brought her upright. The Arizona limped back into Pearl Harbor and was put straight into dry dock. She was actually fixed in Hawaii, which is amazing because it was ultimately what led to her destruction. So the night before, December 7th, a big man by the name of Joe George competed in the heavyweight bout against the champion from the Marines. Now, Joe knocked his opponent out in some very fantastic fashion and then went out to celebrate with his Navy buddies from the Vestal. So Joe liked to fight both in the ring and outside of it and had gotten in trouble more than once. And after celebrating his win that night, he took to the bar and ended up fighting a few Marines who objected to the knockout win against their buddy. So Joe ended up spending the night in the brig, awaiting a summary court-martial in the morning. So now we get to December 7th, and that seemed just like every other Sunday. Battleship Row was serene and calm. There was a church service being set up on the fantail of the USS Arizona, and my grandfather, in the day's dress of a white shirt and shorts, was heading down to sick bay to deliver some oranges to his best friend, Harl Nelson, who was in sick bay. Now at 7:55 a.m., the first alarm started blaring, and the Japanese started their first wave of the attack. So my grandfather dropped his hat and sprinted to his battle station. Unfortunately, he never saw his best friend Harl again. When he arrived at his battle station, so the alarms were still blaring and they were screaming, "Battle stations, this is not a drill." The Japanese planes were strafing sailors in the harbor. It was on fire. The USS Arizona or the USS Oklahoma had capsized. The Japanese high altitude bombers were just getting ready and started their run on Pearl Harbor. So my grandfather and his battle station mates got their gun up and running, and they trained their sights on the high altitude bombers. But as they fired their shells, they found that they were bursting before they reached their target. But, you know, they still were going to try. A strafing plane zoomed near the director, firing bullets into the men. Warren Bruner was hit in the leg, and Frank Lomax ran out to get more ammunition after that, and he was never seen again. 15 minutes after the initial attack, a Japanese high-altitude bomber dropped an armor-piercing bomb, hitting the forward deck and crashing into the ammunition hold. In half a heartbeat, the Arizona's ammunition and over 1 million gallons of fuel ignited, sending the Arizona skyward, nearly 50 feet straight up and slamming back down to the seafloor below. This is the only known footage of the USS Arizona attack. It was taken by a doctor that was on Ford Island. And you can just see the fireball and just the sheer amount of heat and the explosion that hit. It was just massive. The blast hit was such a massive impact that it actually vaporized nearly every sailor on the deck and then those below the decks. Those fortunate to have some protection were still not immune to the pressure wave, scalding metal and fire. George Hollowell, who was in the director with my grandfather, he was forced back so hard that his skull was caved in on one side and he died instantly. So over 1,000 sailors perished in an instant, their lives cut short. Most of them had never even seen their 21st birthday. There were 23 sets of brothers aboard the USS Arizona and one father and son pair that were lost in a heartbeat. An entire generation was gone in a flash. The Arizona was decimated, it was sinking, it was on fire. And then at its hottest point, it actually reached the temperature of lava coming out of the Kilauea volcano. And 6 men that were trapped in the director along with my grandfather, they had no way off. As I mentioned before, the day's dress uniform was a simple t-shirt and shorts, and anything that wasn't covered was just extensively burned. During the explosion, the director door popped open and it was letting in smoke and fire into the small alcove where my grandfather and the other men huddled. As my grandfather reached to close it, his arms and his hands and his sides were they were flash fried in a second, and they had no idea what they were going to do. They were cooking alive on a sinking and doomed ship. I'm not sure anyone could really fully grasp what it was like on the ship that day. The horror of seeing shipmates and friends, brothers burned alive, shot, or actually eaten by sharks, having smelled the blood in the harbor. It was hell on earth, and honestly, no one should have survived it. So Joe George was actually let out of his prison hold early on Sunday morning. And as he was walking back to his cabin, the sirens started blaring and he saw the big meatball on the sides of the planes. And even though he was scheduled for a court-martial that day, he never hesitated and ran to do his duty. He ran to protect his ship, the USS Vestal. As the smoke cleared and the trade winds picked up, there was just nothing but fire and death and pain. Joe was a witness to the most catastrophic loss of life on American soil up until September 11th, 2001. And when the Arizona ignited, it spread flames across 70 feet to the Vestal that was tied up to the Arizona. And Joe was working on trying to smother those flames that were they were everywhere. They were all over the deck. And so my grandfather and his battle station mates were stuck on a vessel with nowhere to go. But finally, the trade winds started to clear up some of the smoke and blow some of the fire downwind, and just trying to clear a path. They saw Joe putting out fires on the deck, and they yelled and they whooped and they hollered as best as their singed vocal cords would allow them to. And finally, Joe George looked up. They finally had hope of getting off the Arizona. So they mimicked throwing a line or some form of tether to the Arizona so they could climb off. But it was nearly 70 feet across and it was elevated. It would take a miracle for the line to get up to my grandpa, but Joe George, he was a miracle worker. He found a monkey's fist and threw it to my grandpa and made it in just one shot. Just one in a million shots. And my grandfather, they tied the line off and they pulled over a heavier line that would hold up under their body weight. Just as Joe was tying off the line, his commanding officer came up to him and shouted to cut all ties to the Arizona, which included the one that he had just tied off. Joe looked at the men on the Arizona, and the commanding officer, knowing what he was going to say, just cut him off and said, "No, absolutely not. Cut the lines. Leave them there. They are dead already." But Joe, he stood up tall. He had a hatchet in his hands and he said, "No, I will not cut that line. I will not leave them over there to die." The commanding officer looked at Joe. He was the heavyweight title holder and he had a hatchet in his hands and he walked away. I don't really think anyone wanted to mess with the big guy from Arkansas that day. So one by one, the 6 men crossed the 60 feet over fiery water while the Japanese planes strafed, sailors on decks in the water, and even them crossing the line. I think the hardest part was going back up once they reached the midpoint because the line would sag. I don't know how, but my grandfather managed to traverse the line and step foot on the Vestal deck. And when he finally stepped foot on the deck, his injuries were so significant and his arms were so badly burned that the skin was just nearly falling off. So he ended up rolling it down his arms like a tube sock, which is just unreal. We asked him later in his life, why he did that. And, his answer was pretty simple in true my grandpa fashion. He said, "You know what? It was in the way." Years later, we did an artist model representation of what his arms and hands look like that day. And here's what they look like. I am going to warn you, though, if you are a little squeamish, definitely close your eyes. It's one of those things that to truly understand what those guys went through, you got to see it. But I'll give you a second to kind of close your eyes and if you didn't want to see that. All right, here we go. When the 6 men finally made it to the deck of the Vestal, you can't even imagine what they looked like. Most of them had second, third, and fourth degree burns. At least 2 of them had bullet wounds. Joe George was quoted once saying that they looked like ghosts, that only the whites of their eyes were visible. And my grandfather remembered saying thank you to Joe. And those were the only words that he ever spoke to the man who saved his life. And he didn't even know his name. He was put on an open air truck and rushed to the triage unit that had been set up for the sailors. And the nurses were running around bandaging wounds, clearing bullet holes, and giving out shots of morphine. One of the nurses had the idea to mark each sailor with red lipstick when they got a shot of morphine. So 1, that they would not overdose them, and 2, because their supplies were just running so thin. There were so many injured. And no one can imagine what that first night in the burden ward was like. They actually had the ward blacked out with no lights visible for the outside because they were in fear that the Japanese would return and they didn't want to give them a target to shoot at. Men were screaming for their mothers, their gods, even for the nurses to kill them. If surviving the USS Arizona was hell, this was a whole new level. Now, every day the orderlies would pass by my grandpa looking over his chart and just shaking their heads. They were sending sailors stateside to recover, and every day my grandfather would be passed up until finally he asked the orderly, "Can I go stateside? What do I have to do to go stateside?" And the orderly explained to him that, his injuries were just far too great to risk sending him home, and he would probably die on the crossing over. And I will say that with what would be the last time that my grandfather disagreed with medical professionals, he flat out stated that he could make it. So the orderly looked at him with kind of a smirk in his face and said, "Well, if you can get yourself up out of bed and stand while we change your sheets, you'll be on the next boat stateside." So my grandfather stood with third and fourth degree burns on his arms, hands, and legs for 25 minutes while they changed his sheets. And true to his word, the orderly booked him on the next boat home, and he arrived in California on Christmas Day in 1941. When my grandfather was finally strong enough to stand on his own again, he shuffled to the mirror in his room and was shocked at what he found. His strapping figure of 160 pounds was totally diminished to a mere 82 pounds. Part of his ear was gone. His hair was totally gone. He was a shell compared to where he was 5 months ago. And then the surgeries and therapy started. He was submerged in saltwater baths to help clean the burns and the wounds. If anybody knows, like getting a paper cut and getting salt water on it or something, that burns pretty badly. So you can't even imagine what, having your entire body submerged in salt water would be like. They also did maggot therapy, which basically would eat away at all of the dead and rotting skin. They would leave the healthy skin, but they would eat all of the rotting flesh. They also had leech therapy. So they did that to coax his blood to start flowing again to some of the damaged tissue. And then finally, they started with the skin grafts. So in total, he was burned more than 65% of his body, most suffering from third and fourth degree burns, mostly his arms and legs. So after nearly a year, his doctor said that he should have his arm amputated, that it would never fully work right again. And my grandfather had finally had enough. He said, "Absolutely not. If you take my arm, what will I have left?" So he checked himself out, received a medical discharge, and then hitchhiked back to Nebraska. So my grandfather worked for a time in Red Cloud with his father, but you know what? He always felt like something was missing. World War II was still raging, and he felt the need to return, and so he re-enlisted. Now the Navy was less sure of his resolve, and they tried to dissuade him. But if you haven't figured out by now, my grandfather has a bit of a stubborn streak. It may or may not be genetic in our family. He pushed until the Navy finally relented, but they had one caveat. He must go through boot camp a second time. And so he headed back out to boot camp. And not only did he pass with flying colors, but he led his unit, pushing them until they were the best in camp. The Navy begged him to stay and train new sailors, but the ocean called to him, and he needed to return to the fight. He needed to avenge his fallen shipmates, but most importantly, he needed to avenge his best friend, Harl Nelson. He was sent aboard the USS Stack, and it was a destroyer deep in the Pacific Ocean. It had a top speed of 36.5 knots, and she was primarily focused on mine patrol and submarine detection, but also participated in 5 additional battles and invasions during the War for the Pacific. She was nearly sunk when a kamikaze hit her broadside, but failed to cause enough damage, and the crew was actually able to fix the leaks fairly quickly. My grandfather effectively started and finished World War II. He retired from the Navy with the rank of gunner's mate, 2nd class. After finishing what he set out to do in the Pacific, he returned home to Red Cloud, Nebraska. He met my grandmother, Velma, and they traveled the world together. They visited Argentina, Alaska, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, while my grandfather worked as a diver for some of the largest oil pipelines in the world. At one point, my grandfather held the record for the deepest dive in a 2-man submarine. His love for the ocean never waned, and him and my grandmother had 4 children together, 2 passing in their infancy just days after being born, and my uncle, their oldest son, passed at 56 years old. But through it all, they loved each other unconditionally. When my grandfather was 92, he was approached by author Ken Geyer and asked why he had never written a book about his life and the story aboard the USS Arizona. And just like before, his answer was pretty simple. No one asked. It became a New York Times bestseller for 8 weeks and is now slated to become a feature motion picture. It'll be the first true retelling of what happened on December 7th, 1941, especially aboard the USS Arizona. Raw, gritty, no holds barred. All the Gallant Men will be truly a masterpiece on the screen. So it wasn't until later that my dad and I wanted to know more about the man who saved my grandpa's life. So no one knew his name, where he was from, or even if he survived Pearl Harbor. So we started digging, and our contacts at the USS Arizona Foundation found an old audio interview from a man named Joe George, although at the time we didn't know his name, talking about his rescue of 6 sailors off the Arizona. Now, Joe in the interview said that they probably didn't survive. They were burned so badly. He never knew that not only did my grandpa survive, but he thrived and had a family of his own. We found Thelma George still living in Arkansas, where Joe was originally born. But to our dismay, we learned that Joe passed away in the early 90s. We could never say thank you for my grandfather's life and for our lives. But we could ensure that he was properly recognized. And thus began our 16-year quest to besiege the Navy. President Bush, President Obama, and finally President Trump to get Joe George a medal. President Trump took up our cause, and with the help of Senator Cory Gardner, Joe was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star with V on December 7th, 2016, standing aboard the USS Arizona Memorial. My grandfather passed away when he was 97 years old, and my grandmother passing 3 months after that to the date. They were married 70 years. It was at his funeral that I was reminded that, time waits for no man, and for each and every person it comes to an end. For me, I found a new beginning on what was the worst day of my life. The Secretary of the Navy spoke at my grandfather's funeral. He talked about his bravery against unfathomable odds. His life summed up in just a few short speeches. It wasn't until after that the SecNav pulled me aside and asked me if I would sponsor the new USS Arizona nuclear submarine. He had announced the names just 2 months prior, saying that the Navy and the US needed to bring back 2 names from the events of Pearl Harbor, and he chose Arizona and Oklahoma. I was speechless. But when he explained his decision to offer me the sponsorship, it was based on my ability to connect to the original crew and to this new world we find ourselves in. I couldn't say no, and so I found my new beginning and my mission. Somehow, my goal is to bridge 80 years of history into the present, ensuring that the future crew is not only taken care of, but they know where their namesake sub came from and the legacy and their history. When the Arizona is completed, it will be the most advanced submersible on the planet. It comes in at 460 feet long, and it'll be the first Block 5 Virginia class featuring upgraded weapons capabilities, multiple unmanned UAVs, and multiple Navy SEAL deployment capabilities. The Arizona will reemerge back into the Navy with 1,177 men as vengeance in her wake. Even though she's named for Arizona, in my heart, part of her will always belong to Colorado, and not just Colorado, but the entire United States. She'll stand for something more and hopefully ensure that future generations never forget where they come from, where their freedom comes from, but most importantly, the cost of what it takes to get there. For now, and the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor coming up, I get to remember the good times, my grandpa and I. I got to sit on his lap and I traced his battleship tattoo on his chest when I was 5, outlining the scars on his hands and him laughing, telling me where those skin grafts came from. Standing on the USS Arizona Memorial for the first time when I was 19, the same age as he was that fateful day. Standing on the USS Arizona Memorial, giving the keynote address for Joe George's medal ceremony, and seeing my grandpa cry for the first time. And him hugging me afterwards, saying just how proud he was. Seeing him hug Joanne, knowing that the Navy finally recognized the man that saved his life. Every moment a memory, and it's etched in my heart forever. I know he and my grandmother are with me always, and every time I speak, I honor the 1177's memory. Thank you for letting me share a little bit of my story. I hope that you take a little something with you today. So men like Carl and Joe and my grandfather and their stories will continue on for another generation. Thank you. All right, I think that covers it.